So currently I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies, and also an affiliated faculty member in the LGBTQ Studies program in the College of Arts and Sciences. My research and teaching are heavily focused on the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and U.S. American popular culture, oftentimes emphasizing representations of Black masculinity and conversations with ideas of vulnerability and resistance.
I'm Dr. Lanier Holt from the Ohio State University, and believe it or not, they're dead serious about that, the part. I study race and media effects, basically looking at the social psychological effects media messages have on perceptions of people of color. In other words, what effect does watching television, engaging with various forms of media, have in terms of how do you view people of color when you see them in the real world? I also have a mentoring group, which we'll talk about later on, called the Holt Official Watch List, or the HOWL, which works to get women and students of color, women of any color, into graduate programs, and thus far it's gotten close to about 40 students over the last 6 years into graduate and law schools.
So as a rhetorical critic, what I'm most interested in oftentimes is the ways in which certain representations, so racialized bodies, communicate ideas about the way the world is, the way the world ought to be, ideas about ideology. But then I also have a secondary area of research which is focused on audience analysis. Recently I published a piece in communication and critical cultural studies that looks at audience responses to the movie Moonlight. And so it's always fascinating to see the ways in which audiences engage those and use those different texts to meditate on how they make sense of sexuality and race being conversant with sexuality in their everyday lives. And a lot of that research indicates that obviously there is a profound impact in terms of the ways in which individuals engage media and the ways in which that influences their perceptions of the world around them as well. So it can have a damaging effect for sure in terms of reinforcing racial bias and things like that, but then also I want to push back against the idea that that's always the case, because also we know that Black audiences as well are also resistive, push back, and actually use a lot of different forms of media fandoms as well in order to sort of reimagine those representations in ways that are meaningful to them.
One of the interesting things about social media, for example, is we had this belief that it was going to be this great democratizer, that it was, you have access to all of these people all over the world. Well, we didn't create it. It didn't manifest that way. What we became is basically balkanized communities. But social media really tells you who you really are in terms of your friend network. Who are the friends that you actually have, that you chose, as opposed to the ones who signed up for the class with you? And what we find is, on average, I think it's something like 75% of whites have one Black friend out of 100 on social media. So if you got 1,400 friends and you got 13 Black friends, you're in that group. The other 25% have none. So when you get a choice to decide who your friends actually are, they're exactly just like you. So you live in a perpetual echo chamber. So increasingly, what you find out from the world isn't what you experience. What makes up the gap between what you experience and know about the world is media messages. And increasingly, that information is negative. And what social psychological research shows is that people don't watch the news as empty vessels. They select the news that confirms with what they already believe. So the difference between, say, a racist and a non-racist isn't the news, it's their belief in it before they ever consumed it. So what research that I do, Dr. Ramasubramanian, etc. do, is look to see, does this still exist, and how do we counteract it? And it's much harder than you think, especially, and the hard thing is with these biases is increasingly white folks look at society as a duality, white and other, which is why there's the term minority. But that's not the reality. Even within the minority, just like skin colors, there's shades and gradations. Like Dr. Ramasubramanian's research, she's tried to counter stereotypes against Indians versus African Americans. And she found Indians, as in people from the subcontinent, those stereotypes are easier to overcome than stereotypes against Blacks. And it's probably because we've been here longer than the Irish, the Poles, the Italians. You pick the group. There's only two groups in America who aren't immigrants, Native Americans and Black people, period. So they have a lot of negativity about us. So that's increasingly hard to overcome. You can overcome it easier with Asians. You can overcome it easier with Irish. In fact, every other group has eventually became white. These biases exist, and these biases are hard to overcome. And these biases come from media and pre-existing beliefs, because often it's not the media that change your idea, it's your endorsement of what the media actually tell you. I think we go beyond media. I mean, one of the things I find, and I'm going to talk about later in my research talk, is there's a theory called drench hypothesis, which is you get somebody or some group that counter stereotypes what you already believe. It tends to overwhelm your negative beliefs about people. However, increasingly academicians believe this is done through research, but the reality is no one's reading this stuff. They're just writing to please themselves and their friends. What often changes people's perceptions more than anything else is actually seeing, interacting, and meeting someone who breaks their stereotypes. I mean, I've published in media psychology, I've published in journalism, mass communication court, in a lot of places, and then you look at the impact factor, it's like, oh my God, it's an impact of 5! And great, that means 5 people cited it, what, over 2 years? I teach 250 people in a class. Then all of a sudden you meet their parents, and sometimes their parents are like, I was surprised that he was black. There's more than 5 people that I influence all the time. I'm a living counter stereotype, so I work to create more people like that, as opposed to just creating, some article that 5 people will cite, 10 people will read, or something like that. Because the reality is, no one lives their life on pages. You live your life on the street. And when you change the people you run across there, then you start changing society.
I think oftentimes, especially in communication and rhetorical studies, when we hear the term counter-stereotype, that's kind of a loaded word in that it's sometimes assumed that means approximating ideas about whiteness in order to counter ideas or stereotypes about blackness. And obviously that's really problematic if that's how we understand counter-stereotype. How do we counteract stereotypes which we understand as negative through more positive representations, right? But it's usually when we hear the term positive, it's, well, that means how can people that are black, people of color be represented in ways that are acceptable by white society?